you think of air power today, you think of thousands of bombers striking by day and by night, of an endless aerial umbrella protecting an invasion fleet. A whole army dropped from the sky or swiftly landed behind enemy lines. The bloodiest war in history, won in part by crushing the enemy's industries, supplies, troops, and transportation from the air. To meet its part in this allied air power, the United States had first to defeat an enemy which was as tough as the Germans, the Italians, and the Japanese. That enemy was time. Time, June 1939. Europe was on the brink of war. Every word of the Nazi government made this plain. Today, Germany, tomorrow, the world. So did every deed. Already, Hitler had Austria and Czechoslovakia in his grasp. In addition, he and his Axis partners had amassed the greatest air force in the world. Germany, 6,000 first-line planes. Japan, 4,000. Italy, 3,000. A total of 13,000 aircraft as compared to England's 3,900, France's 2,000, and the United States' 1,200. The democracies were outnumbered 2-to-1 in available combat planes, and by far more than that in current production. While Axis plants had been going full blast for years, their goal clearly defined, the democracies were barely warming up, particularly the United States, which worked leisurely, producing only 568 military aircraft in 1939, most of them trainers. The Army Air Corps at that time had a grand total of 36 fields and bases in this country and 4 in other parts of the world. Its personnel strength was less than 25,000 officers and enlisted men. In training, it had 367 pilots and 129 technicians. It had 10 combat groups and plans to increase them to 25. The emphasis was on fighter groups of prime importance in hemisphere defense. But this was peacetime, June 1939, while England, neighbor to the Axis, had just voted its RAF an appropriation of $1,300 million, the geographically distant United States furnished its Air Corps with less than 1/5 of that amount.
Then in September, spearheaded by air power, the Nazis struck at Poland, and the European phase of World War II was underway. By June 1940, Germany had grabbed Denmark, Norway, Holland, Belgium, and France, and had pushed England off of the continent. In less than 12 months, her forces had driven to the eastern edge of the Atlantic. And on the western side, how was our progress matching their pace?
Well, trainers on hand had increased from 735 to 1,243, but combat aircraft remained at approximately 1,200. Under the voluntary enlistment plan, personnel climbed from 25,000 to 50,000. Training courses were expanded and new types of training introduced. But our graduating classes of pilots were still small. Bases and stations edged upward from 36 to 77.
The Luftwaffe, in the meantime, continued to spread destruction with attacks on England, Yugoslavia, and Greece. Russia was the next victim. In mid-June 1941, the Germans struck without warning, and by early December had driven to within 30 miles of Moscow. They wanted to win a decision before United States production could reach their opponents and affect the outcome.
Meanwhile, in the Far East, the Japanese had been assaulting China for 4 years, and after the prostration of France, had been trying to pick up French Indochina as a prize. They were warned by our government to stay out, but they went ahead anyway. Therefore, on August 1st, 1941, the United States, Great Britain, and Holland refused to sell Japan any more gasoline or oil. This was taken much to heart by the Tokyo government, which eventually decided upon a bold stroke. The Japanese secretly sent a carrier task force towards Hawaii, where our Pacific fleet and a large part of our air power were concentrated. The attack was made on Sunday, December 7th at dawn and caught Uncle Sam asleep. But the explosion snapped all of America awake at last. With our first-line naval strength greatly diminished, and for the time being rendered useless for anything except hemisphere defense, our forces in the Philippines were cut off and promptly besieged. We lost Guam and Wake Island. The British and Dutch possessions in the Far East were left virtually without help, and in due course, most of them were overrun. Our air installations and aircraft in Hawaii suffered a knockout blow. The first few weeks that followed this sneak attack saw the destruction of over 1/4 of our total Air Force combat strength, and Germany and Italy both declared war on us.
We were ready to untie the national purse strings. Money became our first weapon in the fight against time and the enemy. In January 1942, the Air Corps received $10 billion, more money than it had been appropriated in all 34 years of its history. 3 months later, it received $9 billion more. At the same time, a merger was effected between the old Air Corps and the General Headquarters Air Force, putting them into a unified command. This command, directly under the War Department General Staff and separate and distinct from the ground forces and the service forces, was to be known as the Army Air Forces. The Army Air Forces were commanded from the start by General Henry H. Arnold. Facing General Arnold and his staff were myriad problems posed by the task of converting the AAF sudden paper wealth into the realities of air power. And we lacked one important thing: time, something that all the war bonds in the country couldn't buy. We had to plan, build, and fight simultaneously. And on the correctness of our decisions now hinged the ultimate success or failure of our air power in battle. One of the first problems was the number of combat groups. How many heavy bomber groups? How many fighter? How many troop carrier? How many and what kinds of supporting units? There were 230 types of units to be considered. To bring those units to life required personnel. Personnel meant housing, food, clothing, medical care, pay, insurance, entertainment, all planned for ahead, to be ready when needed. Men with every imaginable type of experience had to be fitted into over 1,000 different types of jobs. This meant instructors and training courses, building contracts, training fields, construction time. And how long does it take to train men for each type of job? Well, here's an example. For pilots, from induction to combat mission, from plan to actuality, almost 2 years. And we were in a hurry. Units had to be furnished with planes of a particular type and model, selected from 190 different models, many of which needed further modifications to accord with different conditions of combat and climate. Would the planes be coming off the production lines by the time the crews were ready to fly them? How many missions would each plane fly in a week, in a month, in its lifetime? How many hours would it be on the ground for repair and maintenance? What about spare parts? What items and how many for what model and series of airplane? What about losses? You couldn't wait until they happened. They had to be anticipated, or replacements wouldn't be ready in time. What about equipment, supplies, and spare parts? There were over 500,000 individual items to worry about. Here was a pattern that demanded nothing less than that the right things be at the right place, in the right amount, at the right time. But the enemy had no intention of waiting politely until we had caught up. The capital of one of our allies, London, had been badly damaged before we were in the war.
At the same time, on the other side of the globe, the Japanese had advanced many miles into China and had forced another ally, the Chinese, to establish a wartime capital at the interior city of Chongqing on the Yangtze River. From their forward bases in China, the Japanese were able to send their bombers on repeated missions to raid this poorly defended city. Thus, the United States, and particularly the AAF, were confronted with severe problems immediately after December 7th, 1941.
At the start of the war, we had 96 bases and stations, with 41 under construction or authorized. Located primarily within the country, their area would have formed an 8-lane highway 23,000 miles long. By September 1944, the AAF had expanded these installations until that 8-lane highway ran 15 times around the world. And to answer the necessities of a two-ocean war, the installations were stretched to cover every corner of the globe. During the tense summer months of 1941, the AAF started expanding in accordance with a plan which called for 83 combat groups. At the time of Pearl Harbor, only 59 of these groups had been activated, and most of them were at best partially equipped and trained. In February 1942, the goal was revised upward to 115. Half a year later, the program was again more than redoubled to 273 groups, of which there were to be 237 frontline striking units, with the balance reserved for the training of replacements. Bomber groups were to outnumber fighters in a ratio of 2 to 1.
A test of the AAF's recuperative powers was provided early in June of 1942. On advice from the Navy that a Japanese task force was approaching Midway Island, almost 100 B-17s were assembled from bases of the 2nd Air Force. When the Japs arrived off Midway, advanced elements had already reached Hawaii, and 26 B-17s participated in the engagement, in which Japan lost 4 carriers, a heavy cruiser, and several smaller vessels. The rest turned and fled. Although our Navy airmen bore the brunt of this battle, the presence and imminent arrival of so much additional striking power assembled at such short notice served to build confidence in both the immediate and more distant military prospects of our country.
And then in August, Ruan, the first all-American heavy bomber attack on Europe. This was a definite sign that our first battle, the battle against time, was being won. Throughout the next few months, the Air Forces continued to put on weight and muscle. Their contribution at the Kasserine Pass in North Africa was most notable. Then in January 1943, we began to open up on Germany. The 8th Air Force raided Wilhelmshaven in strength.
In March 1943, a large Japanese convoy was spotted making its way down the Bismarck Sea. In company with units of the Royal Australian Air Force, our 5th Air Force went after it. A new technique of low-level skip bombing and strafing was for the first time employed. The result was the most astounding victory of the period, the entire convoy being sunk. This engagement marked the doom of the Japanese open water defense concept and pointed clearly to the possibility through superior air power of isolating large forces of the enemy in the islands which they had occupied. Japanese strongholds in the Pacific could be neutralized at little or no cost while we were progressing steadily on the road to Tokyo.
Returning to Europe, in June of the same year, 1943, after a month of furious bombardment, the garrison of Spadillo Airport on the island of Pantelleria threw in the towel. Then came Sicily and Salerno, where the Air Forces again provided a major contribution. Shortly thereafter, Italy became convinced of her vulnerability to large-scale aerial destruction and surrender. The emphasis of the bombardment could thereupon be shifted to Germany, Austria, and the occupied zones of France. Our Air Force kept punching with heavier and heavier blows. 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 sorties in a single day. Now let's look more closely at one particular day. The day the Luftwaffe stayed home. The day that proved our Air Force had come of age. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, the AAF gave a convincing demonstration of its great strength. From the infant of 1939, it had so developed that in this one 24-hour period, it was able to accomplish the following. Send 6,000 airplanes into battle. Fuel them with over 8 million gallons of gas and lubricate them with 250,000 gallons of oil. Man them with 36,000 aircrew members, a force equal to the entire personnel of the old Air Corps in 1939. Paralyze opposition with 9,000 odd sorties. ravaged the landing areas with 6,700 tons of bombs. Rounds of ammunition hammering into supplies on rails, supplies on roads, supplies on water, into reinforcements trying to move up, into Nazi generals trying to organize and deploy, into the hearts and bellies of thousands of German troops who had been told they were ready for anything, but were not ready for this. So with the supremacy of the Allied air forces firmly established, it was possible for our troops to cross the channel with confident expectation of success. We had virtually chased the Germans out of the Western European skies. In the war against Germany, AAF losses were over 18,000 planes. Slightly more than a third of which went down in aerial combat. The rest were mainly shot down by flak. But we had the reserve strength in the pipeline, and Germany did not. Constantly attacked by the Royal Air Force of Great Britain, in addition to the AAF, and harassed in the east by the Russians, the Luftwaffe finally admitted losing 38,000 aircraft to enemy action. The USAAF in turn claimed responsibility for the destruction of some 20,600 German aircraft plus 4,460 probables. With the Nazi armies in France headed back for the fatherland where they hoped to entrench themselves, the AAF received the mission of disrupting their model home economy by a concentrated attack on its principal arteries of transportation. These were railways, highways, and canals. A plan was laid out, and the missions ordered to start. As the campaign increased in violence, the movement of goods throughout the country began to crumble. Still strong militarily on the ground, the Nazis were confronted with logistical failures on their different fronts. First, to a small extent, and then on a rapidly mounting scale. Their highway and mobile field equipment tended to become bogged down for want of gasoline. Their remaining aircraft became frozen to the ground for all but a very few hours each month. A complete lack of such essential materials as wood, coal, iron, and aluminum was now faced by industrial plants which through dispersal, underground movement, and camouflage had managed to survive the bombardments. Labor, still adequate, was left standing by idle machinery. Pressing these men into service as home guards brought no result. Then, von Rundstedt, using the remaining German armored reserve, made a desperate attempt to capture the Allied supply points of Liège and Antwerp and to isolate the Allied northern flank. The Luftwaffe once more rose to his support, but on January 1st, 1945, lost 100 fighter pilots. After a 50-mile gain, the drive was finally halted. Allied aerial attack left its armored and supply vehicles blocking the roads for miles through southern Belgium and Luxembourg. When the Allies launched their counterattack, there was nothing for the Germans to do but retreat and surrender. After 4 months in the first half of 1945, Germany sued for peace, and the war in Europe was over. On May 8th, an armistice was signed in Berlin, formally ending hostilities. What had happened to Germany? For the second time in modern history, that rich country was left a smoking heap of ruins. Stirred by the mania so often repeated that the Germans were a persecuted people, their scientists and chemists were encouraged to develop the most fiendish means of destruction that had ever been devised by mankind. And meanwhile, for years, their expressions of peaceful intentions had known no bounds. Now those same industries, for the most part, had ceased to exist. And the people who had operated them were dead, crippled, or living in cellars out of work. This factory was the Rhein-Horschek Engineering Works. Its buildings covered 25 city blocks and employed 70,000 people. It produced mines, bombs, heavy guns, and tanks. After an attack by 8th Air Force bombers on March 18, 1945, the Rhine-Vorschek engineering works ceased production entirely, and with an understandable degree of permanence. What air power can do to ocean-going shipping, these capsized vessels tell better than words. Second to none in furthering Germany's war effort was her petroleum industry. It was of prime importance to the Luftwaffe. From the beginning of hostilities, it had been a bottleneck in that its production quotas were never met. Concentrated bombing of the industry was started in May of 44 and continued through March of 45. By that time, despite day and night reconstruction work on the part of 300,000 men, 7/8 of this production had ceased. Thus, in a few months was destroyed a tremendous industry which had required 17 years of expense and effort to build. Shortage of aviation fuel eventually cost Germany control of the air over her own territory. Her tanks were immobilized in the field and overrun in large numbers. Her armored grenadier divisions finished the war either on bicycles or on foot. The phase of the air war which aroused the greatest amount of comment was the area bombing of cities. England, Holland, and China had had a share of this and knew what it meant. The United States had not. When it came the turn of the Allies to reply, the cities chosen were preferentially those connected with the German war effort. Munich, the historic capital of Bavaria, was a city of 800,000 inhabitants. When the attacks came, one casualty was the Brown House, the home of the Nazi Party in Munich. Adolf Hitler himself had designed its new interior. Over its door was the party motto, "Germany, awake." In all, Munich was about a third destroyed. Hamburg was the second largest city in Germany and its largest seaport. With 1 2/3 million people, Hamburg manufactured heavy machinery, alcohol, chemicals, jute products, and explosives. But the greatest single piece of devastation fell to the lot of Berlin, the capital city of Germany. It housed the entire central government of Germany together with the headquarters of her armed forces. In its environs were factories producing aircraft, motor vehicles, tanks, electrical equipment, chemicals, and textiles. The most fashionable shopping street was Unter den Linden. Proceeding west from the center of the city on this broad avenue, one came to the monumental Brandenburg Gate, on the other side of which was Berlin's principal park, the Tiergarten. When Berlin was finally overcome and entered by the Russians, Unter den Linden appeared quite differently. The linden trees were desolate, the sidewalks were vacant, and the buildings were burned out and empty. Taking the same ride as before, one arrived again at the Brandenburg Gate. The gate was still there, but it had been closed. The horses on top needed some repair work. The Reichstag building housed Germany's Congress. For 100 years under a succession of dictators, this body had seldom ventured to raise its voice except in approval of steps already taken. Its ruin was one of the most symbolical of all. Old Nuremberg was a medieval city, surrounded by a towered wall and moat. The Nazi Party selected it as a shrine city, and on its outskirts constructed a large stadium and assembly hall. Party rallies with parades and speeches were held there each September. Outside the wall was a modern section with industries making armored vehicles, tanks, electric motors, and diesel engines, and aircraft and submarine components. An important junction point as well, Nuremberg was laid waste by repeated Allied air attacks. The effort of the AAF against the Axis could now be totaled up, and it was as follows. Sorties, 1,694,000. Bomb tonnage, 1,554,000. Rounds of ammunition, 290 million. Aircraft lost, 18,418. After being captured, a number of German officers and officials were asked to explain in their own words the major cause of their downfall. Here are some of their answers. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, Commander-in-Chief of the German Air Force.
The Allies owe the success of the invasion to the air forces. They prepared the invasion, they made it possible, they carried it through. Without the American Air Force, the war would still be going on elsewhere, but certainly not on German soil. The bombing attacks on two elements were the most effective of all strategic bombardment and the most decisive in Germany's defeat. These were synthetic oil works and transportation lines. Without fuel, nobody can fight a war.
Colonel General Yodel, Deputy Chief, Armed Forces General Staff.
I still maintain today that had we only had equality in the air, none of the Anglo-American operations, neither the landing in Italy nor the landing in France, would have succeeded. I am of the opinion that these were achieved solely and exclusively by your total air superiority.
Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Chief of Armed Forces General Staff.
Nobody can ever prove to me that we could not have repelled the invasion had not the superiority of the Allied air forces made it impossible to throw the reserve divisions into the fight.
Field Marshal Karl Gerd von Rundstedt, Supreme Commander of the German forces on the Western Front.
The immediate cause of the debacle on the Western Front was the air superiority of the Allies.
Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, Commander of German forces in the Mediterranean area.
I believe definitely that the critical factor which won the war was the Allied Air Force. Without doubt, the superior Air Force is the most effective weapon in impairing the morale of ground troops.
Grand Admiral Karl Donitz, Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy.
The Atlantic Ocean shrank due to the Allied air forces, so that a large vessel the size of the Bismarck couldn't live there without an escort of aircraft carriers. Main naval losses were from the air.
Major General Fritz Bayerlein, Commander of the Panzer Lehr Division.
The Panzer Lehr Division, Blue Ribbon organization, primed and equipped to hurl the invaders back into the Channel, met its nemesis in Allied air power. The Allied drive from the Normandy beaches was made through a hole blasted by air power.
Meanwhile, back at Washington headquarters, the business problems arising from the widespread activities of the AAF demanded constant attention. To improve performance on the basis of experience, it was necessary to study continually plans, operations, and results with a view to achieving a maximum return from investment in men and materials. To illustrate, let's analyze the growth in striking power of heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force from the second quarter of 1943 to the third quarter of 1944. In terms of a single heavy bomber on hand in the theater during the second quarter of 1943, there were for each such aircraft on hand an average of 0.7 aircraft with units and available for action. Each of these ready aircraft was able to perform 10 sorties for the quarter, and for each of these 10 sorties to drop an average of 1.5 tons of bombs. Thus, for each heavy bomber on hand in the theater, it was possible to base preliminary calculations on a rate of expenditure of 10.5 tons of bombs per quarter. Analysis of these factors resulted in efforts to improve efficiency through better control and more effective maintenance. As a result, the following changes had been accomplished by the third quarter of 1944. For each heavy bomber on hand in the theater, 0.76 aircraft were with units available for action. Each ready aircraft was able to perform not 10 but 26 sorties during the quarter, and on each sortie to drop not 1.5 but 2.1 tons of bombs, which equaled 41.5 tons per bomber on hand for the quarter. Thus, we were using each plane so much more efficiently that the tonnage which had taken 4 bombers to drop in the second quarter of 1943 was being dropped by 1 bomber in the third quarter of 1944. In addition, during this period, bombing accuracy as measured by bombs dropped visually increased 3-fold. This meant that in visual bombing, 1 bomber was now able to do the work not of 4, but of 12. Plans could therefore be revised for a larger scale of operations than was originally contemplated without increasing the flow of heavy bombers to the theater. The effectiveness of each crew increased in a similar manner. In the meantime, the number of heavy bombers on hand in the 8th Air Force had risen from an average of 600 in the second quarter of 1943 to one of 3,300 in the third quarter of 1944. or 5 1/2 times.